you, and even more so to be seen by you and heard by you for those of you that are on the podcast. It's Monday, which means that it's our Common Good News Day here over at the Daily Podcast at Common Good. And I'm Doug Pagitt. I'm in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where it is 11 degrees below zero outside. So if you're in a place that's also chilly and cold, or if you're in a place that's sunny and warm, let us know in the comments. And I'm standing up in my little basement studio for today's podcast. Let us know what you're up to today, what you're doing. Say hello to the other people in the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. You know, on our daily podcast, what we do is we like to take this positive and hopeful but open-eyed journey to engage these questions of what's going on in our world and what can we do in light of it. Well, on today's Vote Common Good podcast, Christian nationalism's role in the insurrection on January 6th was 4 decades in the making. At least that's what our good friend Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove says. And he wrote this fantastic article, and we want to talk about the truth of that reality, that the insurrection on January 6th was caused and created, not by accident, but by intentionality, at least the context for it. And we want to talk all about that. And it was not just randos. It wasn't just conspiracy theorists. It was people also from the Christian background and with Christian tradition and with very specific Christian intention to call people into this kind of action. And that's what Jonathan has written about. And he's an author himself. He's written this really great book, which you should all know about, Revolution of Values, Reclaiming Our Public Faith for the Common Good. Jonathan, fantastic title. Love it, and even better content. So thanks for being a part of this, and we can talk about your article too. But I'm in Minneapolis. You're in North Carolina. What's life like in North Carolina for you today?
Well, I feel for you, my brother, up there in the nether reaches of the north. It's warm and sunny, and yeah, I was outside on the porch this morning. Feels right nice.
Of course it does. You know, people from Minnesota, they always think about, I'm going to go to North Carolina in the winter, but if I do, I may never come home. So that's why we just stay here. That's a Minnesota thing. All right. So Jonathan, you've spent a lot of time, including written a whole book in 2019 about this need for us to reclaim public faith for the common good, and really thinking about the role of Christian faith for Christian people as a public entity. And before we jump right into this, into the article that you have written, which is so meaningful and I think so important for us today, there's kind of a bigger conversation that you have been leading for a long time, which is saying that there's a way to be engaged in public faith that partners with everyone for the common good, which sits in distinct alternative to this idea that either we pull away from society and we just form our own Christian communities and serve ourselves, or we become part and parcel with a political empire that just wants to use the Christian tradition for its own purposes. So would you mind saying a bit about that and what you've written about in the book and how you're thinking about these things?
Sure. I got into this because I grew up in a community that was targeted by the early religious right in the 1980s and 90s. And I was all in. You know, I was an earnest young person who wanted to do all that I could for Jesus. And I thought that meant I needed to become president of the United States. So I began sort of, getting involved in all of the programs that were designed to groom, young people like me to be Republicans for Jesus. And I was in the U.S. Senate as a page when I was in high school, when that narrative began to sort of fall apart for me, largely because what was actually being practiced in terms of policy didn't seem to line up with just the basics of what my Sunday school teachers had taught me back home. And so I began then trying to understand, what was it that had gotten me so off track. And I wrote Revolution of Values really after 20 years of sort of trying to pay attention to the organizations and institutions that had not only devoted themselves to sort of shaping this narrative that I had gotten caught up in, but that had been quite coordinated and increasingly coordinated in their efforts over time. And it was very clear to me after 2016 that that long project had been what had resulted in the basic question that a lot of Christians and frankly more non-Christians ask me, which is, how do so many Christians support this guy Donald Trump? And well, you sort of had to go back and tell the whole story to make sense of it, and so that's what I was trying to do.
Yeah, because there is this larger story that's been unfolding in our society, right? There's been this big movement, really, as you said so well, over decades, 4 decades specifically. And I think people who study this and you look at it in your book does a good job of tracking this, know that movement, sometimes movements sort of, they just evolve, right? They come accidentally. And other times movements are intentional and they're brought about on purpose. And a lot of us, we like to mark our lives by dates, right? So we look back and think, birth date's an obvious one, or an anniversary, or when we moved somewhere, or when something happened, a sort of before and after moment. You mentioned the election of 2016. That was a point that I know changed some of the way that I've been public about my Christian faith, and has changed the way I've thought about what I should do in the world. But now I've marked a new date. And that's January 6th, 2021. I feel like that is a day that I don't want to forget, and I want to work hard on making sure that other people don't forget it. And the reason it's coming up in our news segment of our daily podcast today on Mondays when we talk about common good news is because this is the week that we're going to start an impeachment trial in this country of the former president, or as he was referred to on Saturday Night Live on Saturday as former social media influencer, Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is being impeached for his action and role in this. That's a really big deal, and it's going to be in the news for at least another week. And I'm hoping it doesn't drift from the news, right? The fact that American citizens armed themselves and attacked the United States Capitol on the day when the Congress was going to certify the Electoral College results for the presidency of the United States. On that day, they attacked the Capitol in order to stop that constitutionally mandated action from taking place. By all manners, this was sedition and insurrection ginned up by the president who's going to have his trial. But you write in your article that it's also ginned up not only by the President of the United States and maybe some of the political conspirators, but that Christian nationalism's role in this is central to it, and that particular players' actions in it. So as a Christian person and as a public theologian, as a public pastor, and somebody who runs an organization, talks about faith and politics, well, our DNA is all over this crime scene as well, isn't it? For those of us who want to talk about our own faith and talk about it in a public space.
Yeah, I mean, I think initially some of the reporting coming out of the riot on January 6th observed some of what you can see in that picture right there, that people were erecting crosses out there outside the Capitol, that, there was this sort of, prayer posture that people assumed. The New Yorker reporter who followed the crew into the Senate chamber, actually recorded the prayer of thanksgiving that they offered when they, took control of the Senate chamber. Obviously in a very illegal and seditious way. So I think, that observation got a lot of people beginning to say, well, what's going on here? Why so much connection for these people between their faith and this really radical action? I think after 4 years of Donald Trump, it's almost hard for people to grasp how radical it is, particularly if you're in that circle. But I asked Republican friends to imagine, just like close your eyes and imagine if Mitt Romney had won in 2012 and Barack Obama had encouraged his supporters to pressure Joe Biden not to certify that election. Try to imagine, in your head what that would have been like and what that would have elicited as a response. I mean, this is just asking somebody to imagine themselves in the opposite position. But I think people just find that unimaginable, right? And I think that's a way of saying that the culture that produced Donald Trump is so extreme that it creates, it has even normalized activity that people would just find unimaginable in a different context. So the question that I tried to ask in this article is, well, where did that culture come from? Because if Donald Trump is complicit, then the culture that created him is also complicit. And that is a 40-year story of Christian nationalist organizations building a narrative that would normalize this kind of extremism.
So I'm going to jump into your article, and I don't want to read the whole thing to people, but I kind of do, but I won't this morning. But they should really read it, and we'll put a link in the show notes, and we'll put it on the stream here. This is at the end of your article, and then we'll sort of work our way back. If you don't mind me reading this to you, it says, "Nothing in recent history has exposed the lies of Christian nationalism more clearly than a riot at the U.S. Capitol waged in the Christian God's name." This is so insightful, I think, from you. "We cannot pretend that what we witnessed on January 6th was a strange departure from the normal Christian practice, from the normal practice of Christian nationalist organizations. It was a harvest of the narrative they have sown for the past 4 decades. But facing the truth of Christian nationalist complicity in the Capitol riot may help other Christians see what Reverend Barber, who you work with so well, taught me so many years ago, that there is a way for Christian people of faith to work with their secular and non-Christian neighbors to claim a moral narrative that can push the country toward a more perfect union." Now, I thought was so insightful about the end of that, we can talk about other pieces, is you're basically calling people to be aware that this wasn't an accident, and we can't simply look at it and say, well, Christian nationalism, that's kind of everywhere, people conflating the founding of the country with a Christian call, and it's really not all that dangerous. Sometimes people just kind of, they over-Christianize America, and that's kind of everywhere, but don't worry about that. It's not actually something that's dangerous. You're saying, no, there's an actual agenda behind Christian nationalism that saw what happened on the 6th of January when Christian patriots attacked the Capitol in order, in their minds, to protect the Constitution, because it was not only their constitutional demand as a citizen, but it was their God-given obligation to do so.
Yeah, and I think to see it clearly, it's helpful to look at the origins as much as the result. So if you go back 40 years, where did the impetus come from? Why did organizations form? Why were literally hundreds of millions of dollars invested in sowing this narrative, particularly among white Christians in the United States? And the answer to that, although it's a long story, and I would recommend a few people who've told it very well. Ann Nelson's book, Shadow Network, really outlines many of the sort of organizational connections of how this came to be. Catherine Stewart's book, The Power Worshippers, is very good on this, as is Sarah Posner's new book, Unholy. I think those 3 women have actually paid closer attention to this than most journalists in the country over the last couple of decades, and are well suited to tell the story. But what all of them agree on, and I think anybody who looks closely at this story, is that the people who got together to do this were concerned about the gains of the civil rights movement and the women's rights movement. They saw that as a threat to their power. And in response, of course, you couldn't be anti-women and anti-civil rights. You had to find a way to push back against that shift in power and in public consensus that looked like it was committed to some greater good. And so what happened was the conflation of white supremacist values with Christian values became sort of legitimized under the label of traditional values and biblical values. I mean, if you just ask what people mean by traditional values in most conversations today, or even what people mean by biblical values, it's a very narrow set of issues that were laid out strategically by the founders of those religious right organizations in the late 1970s. And they were laid out specifically to appeal to white Christians who felt alienated from the majority, and in fact, from the majority that had been won over by a very moral movement, the civil rights movement, that had been led by clergy and pastors in many ways. So this was a very intentional effort to change what we mean by moral issues in public life. And if you follow that 40-year story, it took a long time, but people built it into educational curricula. They built it into talk radio and TV. Ann Nelson tells the story of how many local media markets got replaced by these right-wing media operations that were very intentional and that were coordinating with the Christian nationalist organizations through something called the Council for National Policy. So this has taken a long time, but it was all designed to keep Republicans in power. And it's why somebody like me, grew up believing that to be Christian meant you had to be Republican.
So there are so many pieces to that I find fascinating. One of those is just how hard that religious right and Republican Christian cabal worked, right? And sometimes I wonder if those of us who want to see a different kind of a world and want to see alternatives to those narratives don't need to take a page from the hard work and long-term organizing side of all that, right? That and I'm totally opposed to what they did and why they did it and toward the outcomes. But the methodology that they use to say, we want to make sure that this is communicated on radio, on television, through churches, with spokespeople. We want to make sure that people who are in elected office, that everyone who has a finger in the game knows and understands this narrative. We want to push this through. That part of it is fascinating to me, right? And we're going to have many.
Commitment. You can certainly give them credit for commitment. However, I will note that their commitment was very well financed, right?
Okay.
So these people were working jobs that they got paid very well for. I mean, Ralph Reed works hard, but he sure don't work hard for pennies. If you also want to see commitment, you can also look at grassroots pro-democracy organizations that have been equally committed over the same span of time, but have not had nearly the influence, largely because they haven't had nearly the corporate financing that this movement has. I mean, what I want people to understand is that this was a gargantuan effort that had tons of money behind it. And if you just hold it alongside, sort of organizations focused on comparable things, sort of on the other side, groups like yours that are trying to promote, Christianity for the common good. I mean, we're talking greater than 10 to 1 in terms of investment over 4 decades.
Well, I'm 100% with you, and that's where that commitment was leading me and then they asked people to fund that commitment. They went out and raised the money, and this is one of the pieces that is baffling to me, is why those of us who want to see another kind of a world can't, or won't pursue the same kind of background support. So some stuff that I just am very interested in and think it would be important to start working on, because democracy in this country, it's not only bought and paid for. I'm not trying to suggest that. I'm just saying that those who organize and move their resources, their personnel resources, their human resources, their financial resources, their media resources into a common narrative can allow for other people to see and hear and be called into their story. And if we just let this stuff fall away to a small group of people who are out organizing, working hard, and then asking people to put their money into these engagements, I think we're going to end up like the next 40 years is not settled yet, right? I mean, for people who are, our ages, like the past 40 years is probably more where we have spent our life than the next 40 years. But what the next 40 years is going to look like is something that we can start deciding today. That we can start saying we're going to invest in organizations, people are going to invest their commitments, they're going to start working toward these causes and start to be more public. Now, I know there's a lot of reasons why the religious right and the conservative right join together and have allowed religion to be a talking point inside of that group. On the other side, the side where I find myself politically, religion's not quite as comfortable over there. So we have a different set of conditions. It's not so easy as just to say it's one for one. But to build this out, now that's not something we'll fully get into today, but I just want people to know that at Vote Common Good, we're thinking very seriously about this and how we do this and how we do this kind of work. Can I jump into a couple other places here in your article? Because I think this is just fascinating. You write this really great line here where you say, you do a little bit of an introduction. You say, but the crowd at the Capitol on January 6th did not just happen to be overwhelmingly white and Christian in a way that you'd expect the crowd at a NASCAR race or a Garth Brooks concert to be. And then you quote Sarah Posner, who you mentioned a moment ago. And then you go on to say this: without the religious zeal and moral claims that Christian nationalism brought to the insurrection, it's possible the attack might not have happened at all. The riot, it turns out, wasn't so much a political protest as it was a religious crusade in the eyes of many members of the pro-Trump mob. Now, Jonathan, I remember reading this article on my phone. I remember setting my phone down and letting that line soak in. Something you have such a great knack for doing. The riot, it turns out, was not so much a political protest as it was a religious crusade in the eyes of many members of the pro-Trump mob. But as scholars of religious extremism have noted in different contexts around the world, crusades are not born overnight, nor are they a response to any single event. Crusades happen when the structures and symbols of a religious tradition are manipulated to inspire devotion to a political power of one group or the other. That really crystallized it for me, this idea that, hey, this wasn't like a spontaneous response. And I was thinking in contrast to the women's marches that happened in 2017, just after the inauguration of Donald Trump, right? There were a lot of us who really thought that Donald Trump's election was going to be hazardous to the well-being of this planet and everyone who lives on it. And there was massive responses the Saturday after his inauguration. Not 3 weeks before the inauguration, not the day of counting of the electoral ballots. After his inauguration, to say, as a people, we're going to respond. And that felt like, as you mentioned it, this grassroots kind of response. People came together around a moment. And you contrast something like that with this, and you say that's a response to a moment. This was more like a crusade, which was planned for and implemented. Do you want to say any more about that, or do you feel like you've tapped into that already?
Well, I'll say two things. One is that you can see this in some of the reporting on the people who've actually been arrested. There was a New York Times story last week. The FBI has a long history of investigating and prosecuting extremist groups, and they've noted, and reporters who've looked at their report so far have noted that this crowd is older on average than most sort of white nationalist extremist sort of activity, and a lot more mainstream. These are not people that had criminal records. They're in many cases not people they were following because they had not been involved in illegal activity before. These are people who were there because they were listening to Christian radio and they were on these Facebook groups that have formed, out of the lies that they had been told. So there's sort of I think one angle of seeing how this is a sort of radicalization. But the other thing that I would say is that if you know these organizations and the way they've worked with one another, there was reporting back in the spring of last year that they were already beginning to talk about this before the election, right? They knew that the president's poll numbers had been bad. They knew that that with a reasonable amount of organizing that he could lose the election. And so one of the groups that's very well tied into the Council for National Policy is a group called ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. ALEC began planning in April of last year to use state legislatures to try to overturn the election results. So this was not about sort of, discovering, in shock that there was, some, nefarious thing that went on election day that needed to be addressed, which is, the way people were stirred up. But rather, this was a well thought out and planned way to try to subvert a majority opinion that people saw coming for some time. And I think what's, deeply concerning to me is that these organizations that, use our faith that go under the name and label of Christianity, we're very willing to just ignore the basic precept that thou shalt not lie, and participate in this deception all along. I mean, I think that's what sort of gives away the game. It's about deception over and over and over again. I mean, the lie that we were once upon a time a Christian nation and we've got to get back to that is itself a deception. But to maintain that and to sort of gin people up to believe that, you have to constantly be lying to people. And I think the willingness to participate in those lies is tied to this crusade mentality, this notion that you would sacrifice anything for this greater goal of the imagination of this Christian nation that has been concocted in the story. And I think it's terribly sad, not only because it creates the possibility for this kind of extremism, but I mean, the other thing that I talk to folks about all the time is that this has clearly over the last 4 decades done more than anything else to drive people who grew up in the church away from the church. I would say this is the number one reason that the nuns have been the fastest growing religious group in the country. And I always say that's not good news for the convent. It's not the NUNS, that's the NONES. The people who, when asked what religious tradition they affiliate with, say none, because they grew up in a religious tradition that they know now was lying to them.
Yeah. There's a lot of those nuns or non-affiliateds that are former something. Like they're almost like the not anymores, right? Those right. people. And I want to note something here that a conspiracy theory wants to tell you that there's a big story about the world and how it's happened, and it's powerful people doing things in secret that you couldn't know about if it weren't for someone exposing the conspiracy. One of the important differences between, I think, what we're talking about now and a conspiracy theory, and why this is not a conspiracy theory, is that everything you're describing and everything that's been in the books you've talked about in these articles, this is all very well-known public stuff. No one's hiding it, right? Ralph Reed and Franklin Graham and the organizers, they're not meeting in secret meetings that no one knows about. They're sending fundraising letters saying, we need to return America to a Christian nation. We need to rally at this point. You even describe in the article the Jericho marches that happened around the Capitol days before. All of this is public. And this is where the power actually lies of all of this kind of work, because it is intentional, public, planned actions that have produced this outcome, as opposed to, hey, Jonathan and Sarah and other people dug around and they found some obscure email, and if you read right into that email, you'll find out that they were plotting and scamming. That's not what you're describing at all. This is like money that's spent.
I'm no Q, R, S, or T. I'm no secret source. This is all publicly available, fact-based journalism. And it's really sad from a pastoral perspective that our churches have not paid more attention to this, and frankly haven't done a good job of helping people resist it. I wrote up a review of a couple of those books I mentioned earlier last year when they came out, and I was trying to think about, like, how should you tell pastors why these things are important. And I remembered this story from up in my hometown that I heard about a deacon who I knew growing up in a local church, and he was a dear man, led a Boy Scout troop, was well loved in the community. But when his wife died, he grieved for several months, and then he was kind of perky, and he was feeling better around the church, and folks started talking to him. It turned out that he was dating someone, and people were encouraged until they realized that he had gotten caught up in an internet scam. A 70-some-year-old guy who didn't understand that this woman who wanted to meet him and wanted him to send her gifts and such online was actually just somebody using him. And the deacon board had to get together and explain to this brother that he lived in a world that he didn't understand, but that there were people out there who used the internet to try to exploit people like him. And I thought it was a good example of how there are cases where we come together and explain to people, you are being deceived. And that's a loving thing to do. And I think it's incredibly important for pastors and churches to come around people, and whether it's QAnon or whether it's just this sort of notion that the culture is against us, and that we've got to get back to some past that never existed, whatever it is, that these are lies that people are using to benefit themselves. And a lot of people who do them are just doing it to make money, but the people who invested the money in it are doing it to maintain political power, and people are being used. And I think whether that's just helping somebody get out of something that's going to land them in an insurrection, or whether it's helping them get out of something that's going to alienate them from neighbors who God created in God's image and whom they could love. Whatever the case, it's an incredibly important lie to help people get disentangled from.
What is your take on the best way to help people overcome lies like this? My impulse is the best way to deal with negativity is with positivity. The best way to deal with lies is truth. The best way, it's like your body's best way to deal with a virus is to have antibodies that can fight it, right? And you build antibodies by having a healthy system. Do you think that approach is the way, or do you think there's we have to get out and tell people that they're believing lies? And here's why I don't think that works, but I'm willing to be convinced is I don't think people just simply stop believing things. I think they swap one belief system for another. And until you have something to swap for, you won't let go. It's like a kid on the monkey bars, when you're a kid. And if you think that other monkey bar is so far away you can't reach it, you're not going to let go of this one until you can get your hand on that one. And a lot of us go hand by hand down the monkey bars and don't free trapeze swing right into those things. So it feels like we've spent a lot of time, people running around saying, this was never a Christian nation. Don't think about it as a Christian nation. But the idea this was a Christian nation from its founding, and that's what's made this country good, is that God's blessing on this as a Christian nation has made us good, and that's what makes us great. Like that whole argument, for people just to say, don't believe that, and don't give people another story, seems that it hasn't worked over the last 212 years.
Yeah, and the incredibly good news is that we do have a better story. I think that's the thing, that we need to invest in communities that tell a better story and invite people into those communities. That's why I'm part of the Poor People's Campaign, which calls itself a national call for moral revival. It's a campaign, for poor and marginalized people that's specifically focused on shifting the moral narrative in the country. Because what we say is that, our problems are not only the interconnected injustices of racism and poverty and ecological devastation in a war economy, but also this distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism that has created a context in which these extreme injustices have been not only normalized, but have been named as part of a sort of righteous Christian crusade that people are willing to defend. And so the way you overcome that is by giving people something better to be part of. And I think that's especially important in rural and predominantly white areas of the country, because there are spaces in this country where, if you go to the local church, if you listen to local radio, and if you just participate in the local culture, there's really not a way to get out of this echo chamber that has been created. And it's going to take serious work and effort. It's not that there aren't people in those places who don't see through this. It's just that there's no public institutions that you could participate in where you would be able to publicly identify and connect with the people. I mean, frankly, when I do organizing out in rural North Carolina, for example, there are places where people have all the Republican signs in the yards, and there are places where people have no political signs in the yard. And from my perspective, in terms of overcoming extremism in elections, I always feel like it's good news if there are no signs in the yard, because nobody's going to be, out there with a bunch of Democrat signs in the yard. It's just there's no public group to associate with if you don't buy into this narrative. And so I think that's our task. We have to build the social networks, the organizations, the public institutions that offer people a better narrative.
So, John, I know you got to run here in a minute, but can I just ask you one more thought on this, and that is the little lies. I think back to the moralist preachers that I heard when I was a teenager and got into Christianity. Like, if you lie about the little things, you're going to lie about the big things, right? Which is probably true. And the little lies are what soften people up for the big lie. And there's been a number of big lies, including the election was fraud and we have to take over the country, and then all the crazy QAnon stuff, right? With its, Democrats are pedophiles and there's some big cabal going on and you can't be Christian and be a Democrat, all this kind of stuff. The little lies that lead to that are people saying this was a Christian nation. And I hear two versions of it. It's almost like it's been given away that it was a Christian nation. One version is it was a Christian nation. We should get back to that. The other, which I hear from people whose politics feel a lot like mine, they'll sometimes grant that. They'll be like, okay, sure, this was a Christian nation, but we shouldn't go back to that because it was the kind of Christian nation that said only white male landowners should have political rights. And see, that's the problem with those Christians. They were just wrong back then. They were right about the country. They were wrong about how we should organize the country. We have now progressed because we're progressives. So we're going to leave that Christian heritage behind and now move into a more secular society. And then you now have an argument between return to a Christian society or move forward to a secular society. Now, I think both of those are wrong-headed ways to tell the history of the country, but they both begin with just granting, of course, this was a Christian country and its intention was to be Christian. And I know you think differently about that. And so I don't know if you can get all into it now, but what's a better way to deal with that little lie that actually is the root of the very big one?
Well, I mean, there's good history that helps. You can look closely, as some historians have done, at the religious lives of the founders of the country, and like many communities, they were all over the place. There were practicing Christians. There were deists.
Right.
There were people who didn't care much one way or the other about religion, frankly. And also, a little history can help people realize that what most white evangelicals understand today as a sort of Christian identity didn't even exist in the 18th century. I mean, it was just a different world. Church attendance in the colonies, I think, was often below 30%. Of the population. So, this is a different world than the one we live in. I think it's sometimes helpful for people to see that. But I think you can also pay attention to, the basic questions of what people came together around in terms of establishing a democratic society. And the conversation about religious freedom early on is a really important conversation, because religious freedom is one of the things that has been manipulated by Christian nationalists to try to sort of claim this narrative. But it's really clear that the experience of Roger Williams and John Leland, who was an abolitionist and who argued with his friend James Madison that religious freedom should be central to the Constitution, was really about protecting the religious beliefs of people who didn't line up with the mainstream church of the time, and saying that this could be a pluralistic society, that it could be a place where people who believe different things could nevertheless agree on issues of the common good and of a way of pursuing life together in a democratic society. That was sort of the radical notion and the ideal that, of course, had been theorized in Europe by the people who had observed the dangers of the religious wars there, but was sort of hashed out and attempted to put into practice, and through practice into the letter of law here in the United States. None of that story is a story of the formation of a perfect society, right? I mean, from the very beginning, it's a white supremacist society. It's a society full of compromise. Where you talk about all people being created equal, but you hold some people as property. I mean, all of that is deeply compromised. The genocide of the people who were here before, and nevertheless, in that complicated story, there's plenty of evidence to dispel the notion that that anybody ever thought that it was some sort of kingdom of God come on earth as it is in heaven.
Yeah, it's almost like these same battles that we're struggling with today, these arguments about who we are, how we're going to live. These have been around for the entirety of this experiment of this nation, right? And sure, there were some people, in the late 1700s that were arguing that we should be more Christian, and others arguing, no, we should be more pluralistic. That's the point, right? Is that these same arguments have been ongoing. It wasn't a Christian nation. It wasn't only started for that purpose. Sure, there were some people who, just like right now, live as if it's a Christian nation. There were people at previous times. So you can find writings and you can find statements from that period of time. The point is, it was an argument. And that argument was always settled on the side that said, it will not. That's why the Bill of Rights gives this clear call that we're going to have a nation in which people can move freely. And the amendments then sanctify that into our congressional or into our constitutional idea in this country. Yeah. So it's, and this is, what I like about this way of thinking about this story is this puts us in the same flow with those who have come before us, right? We now have to do our work in our day the way that others did their work in their day. And in these 200 and some odd years of this country, we have waxed and waned from this. There was a period of time in the 1950s when Christian religion and Christian nationalism was ascending. It was a mistake then, it's a mistake now, and to try to go back to it, which a lot of people think this is where "In God We Trust" gets put on our currency. Yeah. This is where the Pledge of Allegiance is introduced. This is where Christian churches become part and parcel with civic religion and bless it as a particularly Christian expression, because we're dealing with all kinds of issues from the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. So, it's kind of the history of all of this that we need. So
we do, yeah. Best account of that history you were just summarizing is from Kevin Cruz in a book called One Nation Under God. Part of what I think he captures about that era is the way in which that sort of broad bipartisan Christian nationalism of the mid-20th century was specifically an attempt to push back on the New Deal and on the policies that FDR's administration had pushed through. Totally. And it was an attempt to associate free market capitalism with Christianity and appeal to many of the same people that the Christian nationalists are appealing to today. So yes, there is a long story of how our faith has been manipulated. But the other story that I think we have to keep coming back to and keep sort of reminding people is that, there is a story of faith that has pushed this country over and over and again towards, greater practice of democracy and towards greater justice. And that is the faith that motivated the abolitionist movement, that motivated the women's rights movement, the labor movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, and frankly today that I think should lead all of us to pursue, this faith in public life that is for the common good and that makes it a better place not only for you and me to live, but especially for people who are living with their backs against the wall to live.
Yeah, I come from a state where our former Senator Paul Wellstone used to say, "We all do better when we all do better," right?
That's
so let's
right.
figure out how to make sure that we all do better. It's not a zero-sum game where we take some from others. Jonathan, thank you for all your good work. Thanks for being such a friend to the Vote Common Good world and being a Vote Common do-gooder yourself, and for your great. This is his book again. It's called Revolution of Values: Reclaiming Public Faith for the Common Good. If you have to pick one book to read, pick this one. And his article, Christian Nationalism, was 40 years in the making. Really been powerful and revolutionary for me. So, Jonathan, thanks for being on the.
God bless you, brother. Grateful for all you're doing.
Well, we sure appreciate you, friend, and we'll stay in touch. So thank you, Jonathan, and hey, stick with us, friends, if you're going to be staying around here. Jonathan's he's got important things to do, and he's going to be off doing those, and we'll stay connected with him in the future. But we just want to remind all of you that, look, the common good news is right now, the reason we're talking about this week is because this election of 2020 showed us once again the realities of this country. Look, it's easy to say that's not who we are as a country. Well, it is who we are as a country. I know a lot of Republicans are trying to come to grips with who are Republicans as a party right now. Well, sure, you're the party of Liz Cheney, but you're also the party of Marjorie Taylor Greene, the QAnon supporter. You're both of those. You're not one or the other. And as a country, we are people with the common good in mind and people who say, first the good should go to some, and then it can go to others. But this is who we are. We are all these things. And this is why we have to work this out. We have to figure out how we move forward. What we cannot do in this country, because it's not possible, nor is it right, is to simply say, these people don't matter. So what we're going to be doing around Vote Common Good is we're going to be engaging pretty aggressively in trying to help people to be involved in the role of engagement with others to help people have an alternative story that they can swap to. Because again, I don't think people are just going to stop believing things. They need to start believing something new and something fresh. And for all of you who've given up on the Christian faith and say, I'm former all that, I get it. But if there's any chance you could reclaim the parts of your faith to carry you forward so that when you meet someone or you talk to a relative or you talk to a neighbor who still identifies inside of the Christian tradition, you can say, as an insider, I'm telling you, there's another story, there's a better way. Right? Those of us who follow the Gospels and the teaching of Jesus, you know this is what Jesus was big into. His most famous and I think powerful rhetorical pattern was to say, you have heard it said, but I say to you. I've written a whole book about this called Flipped. You can pick that up somewhere. But Jesus' idea that you have heard it said, and I say to you, that's not something we only have to leave to Jesus. We can actually say to people, I know you believe this. I know you've been told this. But I want to tell you there's another option as well. There's another way to be. So if we're going to build some middle, as I was encouraged to hear Bruce Springsteen during a Jeep commercial call us to last night during the Super Bowl, if we're going to live somewhere where we can meet between the polarization and the polar sides of this country ideologically, lived experience, racially, then we have to be able to say there is a story that can bring us together. And the Christian tradition's primary call is that you would renew your mind, that you would repent from old ways of thinking and living and being into a way that is good for all. It's sort of essential to the whole thing. It's the good news part of the good news, right? Is that you can change your way, your thinking, and your being. And that's what's going to be going on in our country over the next number of weeks. Now, in the news, lots going on, of course. We're going to be obsessed in this coming week with the impeachment of Donald Trump for his participation. Because look, like everybody's, got their own take on who's responsible for this. But when you're the sitting president of the United States and people are carrying flags and screaming your name and for your benefit, they charge the Capitol, you're kind of part of that. And I think the man needs to be impeached because I think he ginned it up. But even if you want to say he wasn't trying to get them to do that, he did nothing to stop it in the hours it was going on. That in and of itself should be enough for him to never run for office again, to have that right taken from him, and for him to not receive the pension that's paid to former presidents. So I think that would be the right thing to do. We have a petition over at votecommongood.com. You can go to votecommongood.com. You can find that petition, and when you're there, you can sign it. And we're sending it to the Senate when they start the trial tomorrow, and we're going to be delivering thousands of faith voters saying it's time to impeach Donald Trump. But listen, impeaching Donald Trump does not get all of us off the hook. He's not our scapegoat. Donald Trump needs to be responsible for Donald Trump, and we all need to be responsible for ourselves and for one another. So what we need to do is make sure that what we're doing is doing the work in the areas and places where we're engaged. Here's an article from Politico magazine. I think it's really quite powerful. The author writes this: For 2 decades, the United States government has been engaging with faith leaders in Muslim communities at home and around the world in an attempt to stamp out extremism and to prevent believers vulnerable to radicalization from going down a path that leads to violence. Many of us know this. It's been going on for a very long time. Now, after the dangerous QAnon conspiracy helped to motivate the insurrectionists at the U.S. Capitol, with many participants touting their Christian faith, and as evangelical pastors throughout the country ache over the spread of the conspiracy theory among their flocks, it's very real human toll. It's worth asking whether the time has come for a new wave of outreach to religious communities, this time aimed at evangelical Christians. Now look, I don't think that it's a question any longer. Should we be reaching out to evangelical leaders and pastors and churches and Christians and asking them to engage in the one anotherism that is both this country's great promise and our Christianity's great call? Of course we need to. And we need to get busy helping people to make a move away from Christian nationalism. We'd love to have you in on this with us. If you support Vote Common Good, this is where your money's going to go. If you have ideas already, please send us a note over at podcast@votecommongood.com, or I'm Doug@votecommongood.com. You can email me directly, or you can put a note in any of the places where you're watching this right now. We believe it's necessary and crucial for us to start engaging in changing the set of conditions that caused the insurrection to happen in the first place. And that's the kind of work that we're going to be engaging in. We're also going to engage, of course, with candidates to help them speak to faith voters in better ways so that faith voters know that their only option is not a Republican because they're the only ones who do outreach to them or ask them for their vote. We're going to try to solve for that too. And we're going to try some greater messaging on how you can be somebody who engages in the common good as your political value and your political stance. And then political parties can be approached through the lens of the common good. So that's what we do. We're so glad that you're with us here in all of this. We're so proud that you'll spend time with us on these mornings or that you listen on the podcast. And look, if somehow you got to this sort of accidentally and you've just listened to 1 or 2 episodes, would you go over to the podcast link at votecommongood.com/podcast and subscribe? Or if you're watching this on YouTube, subscribe there. Or if you're on Facebook, tag a friend. Tag a friend right now. Do you have a friend that you think should have been listening to this? Just tap that little @sign, type their name, and let this feed show up in their feed, because we do want people paying attention to this. If you're on Twitch, if you're on Twitter, if you're on Instagram, on any of those places, please share this with friends and family. Now you know that it's Monday, so that's the day we talk about common good news. And just a little programming note, on Tuesdays, our daily podcasts at 10 a.m. Central Time is hosted by Rob Ryerson and myself, and we talk about common good politics. So join us for that tomorrow. So much stuff happening for tomorrow. It's going to be just such a great day. Then on Wednesday, we move it an hour earlier to 9 a.m., and at 9 a.m., we talk about common good faith, and that's with Laura Truax and Dominique Gilliard and Stephanie Spalding and myself. And then on Thursdays, common good issues, and this Thursday, we're going to be talking about abortion. Actually, for the next couple of weeks, we're going to talk about abortion and how we can talk about abortion in ways that are more personal, more connected, and less political, so that our political responses to the issue of abortion are more suited to the common good. And then on Fridays, it's Science Day, and we talk science and economics and those kinds of things. And Paul Wallace joins us every other Friday. So we have something for you every day. We're really proud that you're willing to be part of this with us. And thanks for spending a little bit of time with us here today. And I'm Doug Pagitt. We're really glad, I'm Doug Pagitt, and we're really glad to have you with us. Thanks, and be sure to share this with your friends, family, and others. And let's pursue a little faith, hope, and love for the common good. Thanks.